Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for having me this afternoon. Let me try to figure this out here. So I wanted to talk a little bit this afternoon on the use of language in wildlife management, what we're still calling wildlife management, but more appropriately, wildlife coexistence and issues that arise within wildlife coexistence, not just here in Alberta, but in BC and across Canada and throughout North America. Before I get there, I wanted to tell a couple stories. We've heard this morning from multiple individuals about government staff, other industry partners, and how advocates are referred to. I've been called many names myself, and I think one of the best ones was the granola munching, leaf licking, soy latte drinking Starbucks cowboy. And that was a fairly recent one. I thought we responded to it fairly well. I actually had to do a little bit of self-reflection, and coupled with Leslie, we formulated a response that was fairly self-reflective, I think. It started with an attachment, which was that photograph. And we said, in active combat operations, your body needs about 6,000 calories to survive. And as a result, soldiers actually do eat quite a bit of granola. So, fair point. And as far as the licking leaves was concerned, when you do escape and evasion training, fresh water and dehydration will kill you. And so finding alternative and innovative sources of fresh water is very important. And so, fair point, I did lick leaves. And I have worn a cowboy hat before, and I grew up around horses, so yes, I probably have worn a cowboy hat into a coffee shop at one point in my life. However, the soy latte part was unfounded. I do prefer almond milk. And so there's a message to this next story I want to tell, and I do want to tell one story from Afghanistan. I think the Army is probably one of the best examples of a failed social experiment that we could ever envision. And if we boil it all down, essentially what's happened is you've taken an applicant pool, you've excluded all of the female energy. What you have left, you then only take the A-type personalities. You dress them in body armor, give them ammunition and weapons. You put them in a tiny little tin can, you zip them across the ocean, and you drop them in the desert, and then you say goodbye to them for 6 months. And that's somehow a good idea. But as you can imagine, there are a lot of stressors in military operations and military work. But there's also examples and stories of compassion. And that's one of the stories I would like to tell you. So there we are. This is Afghanistan here. And what you're looking at is actually a poppy field right before the poppy field has sprouted. And it is desert, but it's been irrigated from old Russian entrenchments from the 80s, which is why it looks so green in this picture. Everywhere around here is completely desert brown. And our encampment, which is just south of the Arghandab River here, is just outside of the left frame of this photograph. So we lived outside the wire. I worked in specialized policing and intelligence team. We lived outside the wire in these villages. And for about a month, there was this late night ruckus that was occurring. And we thought it was some form of rodent of unusual size or a large desert rat that was terrorizing us and going to eat us in our sleep. And it was especially on like a sentry watch right around 3 o'clock in the morning when you hear a crash, bang, rattle, rattle, rattle. It's quite startling. You don't quite know what's going on. But we, being the enterprising individuals we dug a hole in the desert floor. We used an old empty ammo can, and we improvised a live trap. And it took another few weeks, and then it was about 3 o'clock in the morning one night. All you hear is stand to, we got him. And so this was the terror of Afghanistan. Hedgehog. None of us in our pre-deployment training were ever trained in the indigenous wildlife of Afghanistan or what type of wildlife could be present in the desert. So we kept him around, and Afghanistan has wild hedgehogs, and we named him Sonic. And he was the most disarming little guy that you could ever hope to meet. And about another month after this, we're about 3 months in now, another month of him hanging around. We were sitting there one day and we're going, that is one fat hedgehog. And he was eating, and when we were looking at the back of the military rations, and going back to my calorie comment earlier, is the bread that he liked. Had a good 500 calories in one little tiny slice, and he was eating a few of them a day. So he was the most habituated desert hedgehog we've probably ever seen. So we put him on a diet, and eventually he went his own way. The point of the story is even in the highest stress environment that we can imagine, an active combat operation, there is still a place for compassion and empathy with regards to not just indigenous wildlife, but animals as well. And I know there's a Purple Poppy campaign for service animals that's happened. But I think there was a presentation on either coming up or just not. So coming home from the military, I did take an honorable release, and my career choice at that time was to join the BC Conservation Officer Service, which is the Fish and Wildlife Service here in Alberta. And the provinces, there's 5 provinces in one territory that all train together. So our basic training was actually in Hinton. There's a very similar ranch in Hinton, which is used as a government facility for training. And they call it the Western Conservation Law Enforcement Academy, and that's where you go to be trained as a environmental police officer, if you will. And the 5 Western provinces and the Yukon all train at the same academy. So if you're ever wondering why some of the bureaucratic responses that you receive in Alberta are similar across the provincial lines, it is because there's a commonality in the training, and the academy is actually the same for the officers. It's also why they all carry the same service weapons, the same equipment, why their uniforms are very similar, aside from their shoulder flashes, their uniforms, and they all dress very similar. And that's why it's a standardized training process in the 5 Western provinces. So that was me there. The incident that was referred to by Lisa was, it was about 2 years into my work as a CO. I was attached to the RCMP detachment in Port McNeill on a pilot policing project. And there was a provincial state of emergency declared at this time due to forest fires. And so I was actually on security duties for an evacuation that was taking place within the community. And while this evacuation was taking place, as you can imagine, there's quite a few wildlife calls and or complaints coming in as a result of this forest fire and wildlife fleeing the forest fire. And a mother bear and 2 cubs was one such call. And I received, still to this day, I can't believe it's a thing, but I received a kill order for the family unit, and what they were referring to as a family unit, which, as Lisa mentioned, I respectfully declined. And for that action, I was with the very next morning, so within about, I think this was actually 4 o'clock in the morning when the first call came through. So the very next morning, by the time this was over, I was suspended without pay pending performance and investigation and formal termination. And at this point, I'd worked in 6 different countries in an armed law enforcement capacity, including the Canadian Forces. So it was quite an odd thing for me to see what was being categorized in this agency as a kill order, and specifically for a provincial constable to receive such a kill order. There is no such thing as a kill order. You don't order soldiers or police to kill. It's not a thing, and it hasn't been a thing in global society since the Nuremberg trials post World War II. So to receive such an order was a little bit shocking and also quite concerning for myself. So it was declined, and quite an interesting legal battle ensued. Those are the 2 cubs. They were not killed. They were successfully rehabilitated. They were radio collared as one of the first pairs of captive reared orphan black bears that were radio collared in BC. They were released without issue back into their home territory on North Vancouver Island, and they never did come back into conflict. There was no issues with the rehabilitation process or the release process or the post-release process, being this allegation that orphan cubs can come back into conflict. Wasn't the case here. Conversely, about 6 months after my situation, the fur bearers and Leslie, who you just heard from, were involved in the exact opposite situation, where a conservation officer attended the private home of an individual who had rescued a orphan black bear on the side of a highway, and despite there being rehabilitation available, and despite there being a willingness to rear the orphan bear and re-release him into the wild, he killed the black bear cub, which prompted a complaint to the service about his conduct, and subsequently another legal challenge. And the courts in BC recently rendered a decision that the duties of a conservation officer have never been properly defined, and they weren't properly defined before the court. So while the authority may exist within our Wildlife Acts, and the BC Wildlife Act is a little different than Alberta's Wildlife Act. It's a little more detailed and codified. But nevertheless, both acts remain the same, where the duties of officers are not prescribed or codified in our provincial legislation. And they haven't been since the Wildlife Acts were conceived. Historically, however, they have been, and I'll get into that in a moment. So, coming out of the conservation officer service and this situation, I took a senior law enforcement role in the Ministry of Forests, where I essentially was responsible for investigating provincial forestry offenses, usually involving some form of corporate or financial fraud to do with logging corporations and things like this, and was successful in some fairly major investigations in the province. A couple of them which are still before the courts. The other thing that I did was I went back to school, and I was accepted into a doctoral program in social sciences at Royal Roads. And actually, Shelley Alexander's here, who's my dissertation supervisor as well. It was a few years ago now. We're just sort of in the tail end of that project. And the project's aim was to pull a century of law enforcement records in BC and actually conduct an archival review of the Conservation Officer Service from its inception through all its iterations up to present day, and all of the changes in legislation and ministerial portfolios that had occurred in that last 112 years, or whatever it was. It was 112 years. And we were met with quite a bit of resistance a few years ago in receiving those records. There was some success through alternative means, and ultimately what's being found and what is currently before the committee in an editing stage is a report on the historical context of these law enforcement organizations and how they relate to wildlife policy, and more importantly, the enforcement of wildlife policy and regulations in our provinces. And historically, wildlife branches were a part of the provincial police forces, and they didn't fall under these ministry-run initiatives which allow the adoption of policy kind of on the whim of the day. What the role of the law enforcement branch was historically, and where it should still be today, but sadly is not, is strictly in the enforcement of provincial laws, much like a police force. And in those days, it focused predominantly on poaching and illegal export of wildlife and wildlife parts, or the import of wildlife and wildlife parts. Environmental crime more broadly, such as water diversion or things like this. Today, we've morphed into this post-policing world where we now enforce government policy, which is not law. And in the wildlife context, those policies are under this guise of what we call human-wildlife conflict. So we have law enforcement agencies performing administrative ministerial functions, which enforce policy directives from bureaucrats, not our legislation and our regulations. And again, policy is not law. Policies are written by bureaucrats and ministry managers. Laws by our legislature. And those are two completely different things. And for wildlife, what we're calling wildlife conflict, and what I'll touch on here in a moment in the use of language, is these wildlife conflict policies and the use of law enforcement services to enforce them, I find is very inappropriate and was never the historical intention of these services or how they were developed. So we'll touch on language here in a second. I think the questions speak for themselves. There's, when we look at wildlife conflict, if we ask ourselves what is wildlife and what is conflict, wildlife is, unfortunately, there's no universal definition of what wildlife is, even in Canada, just our own country. It changes from province to province and from legislation to legislation. And what the federal government might see as wildlife is different from what each province might see as wildlife, which is different than how policy might define wildlife for a prescriptive purpose or management function, or if you're involved in industry, depending on what you've lobbied for. Yeah, if no one's seen that cartoon, I find it quite humorous, which is why it's there. So we touched on it a little bit this morning, and at the risk of repeating the previous speakers, I think when we look at wildlife conflict, it's important to break it down into its parts. And if I was to advance a very progressive and alternative view, what if we said there was no such thing as wildlife conflict? What if that was not actually a thing? What if it was a complete misnomer that's somehow been adopted into everyday language? In fact, we could go farther to say there's no such thing as wildlife management either, or to say that wildlife management requires us to first assume that wildlife should be managed in the first place. Let's leave that one alone for a second and just focus on wildlife conflict. Wildlife plus conflict, and especially from someone with the perspective of a soldier and a law enforcement officer, conflict means something completely different than what we're referring to in the context of wildlife. Conflict in the discipline of, say, peacekeeping operations means something entirely different than what we're referring to when we're talking about wildlife conflict. Conflict, generally speaking, when we're referring to the human world, requires active and willing participants. So there's a situation where there's two opposing sides in conflict with each other that are willingly and knowingly in conflict with each other. They understand that they're in conflict with each other. And whether or not they speak the same language, whether or not it's a territorial dispute or an ethnic dispute like we've seen in many places of the world, this concept of conflict requires this active and willing participation into this human-created language world of what conflict is. But it's not so with wildlife. This human construct of this is what we are going to call conflict. If a bear enters my backyard, it's in conflict with me. Is that appropriate? Is that an accurate assessment of the situation? Or are we more aptly referring to a human-human disagreement over the management and expectations of that animal? And I think that might be a more progressive way to begin reframing what should be described as coexistence concerns or coexistence issues. It's, in my view, it's not true that there's such a thing as human-wildlife conflict. And why I take such a firm stand on that is because we use law enforcement services to enforce this role of public safety provider when there's a conflict. And so conflict can be, the term conflict in a policing environment can be misappropriated. And I think in this situation, what we see, at least in our Western provinces, which are fairly standardized in their training procedures, we see what I view as a misappropriation of the concept of conflict when it comes to wildlife. And as a result, we see aggressive, what I would be comfortable in saying is a fairly aggressive response to often a perceived public safety or conflict issue, when in reality it's more so a disagreement over an expectation or relationship with a non-human species. I think that was really heavy. It's a pretty thick conversation, I suppose, getting towards the end of the day. But Bear's fault. I'll leave it at that because I'm out of time here. But when we look at the use of language, we talked a little bit about this whole concept of wildlife coexistence and what if we didn't say it was a thing. We actually have these words being trained in the Western Conservation Law Enforcement Academy, two officers specifically for media responses. And you are told, use these buzzwords because what you're doing is a public safety issue and the public needs to understand that there's a risk. Otherwise, it might not be justified. So these are, in fact, when we rewrote the Wildlife Act fairly recently, the word dangerous wildlife at the recommendation of the Ministry of Environment ended up into legislation, which it was never there before. And black bears, by definition, are now dangerous wildlife. And so we can see this iteration of and this progress of and framing of wildlife as a public safety risk, and it's a fascinating exploration of the use of language for quite dark purposes, actually, when you boil it down. Yes.
So their system only works if humans stay the victim then. If we're the victim and wildlife is the perpetrator. That's the only way their system works. And they have all the power and wildlife has no rights.
It's pretty easy though, right? Because wildlife doesn't talk back to you. Non-human species don't talk back to you. Yeah. And so it becomes without correction, without counter, it becomes a fairly easy narrative to advance, right? And you look at reporting, it doesn't bleed, it doesn't lead, right? And that's the age-old adage used in reporting. So, and it's very much the same in law enforcement and report writing and government style narratives, where this risk-based, fear-based messaging becomes the justification for financial resources, expenditures, new recruitment. I need a new vehicle because I provide a public safety service, not just on and on it goes.
So they have all the power and no accountability.
Yes, under the current system, and that becomes the rub. Is if we're going to have an environmental policing service, fine, I'm all for it. Where's the accountability mechanism? I agree. We actually need environmental policing services. We need environmental police officers, in my view. But if that's the case, that the majority of the duties they're currently doing have absolutely nothing to do with dressing up in a municipal police uniform and running around in a patrol vehicle. It's just that they're completely different tasks. You know, now, is that to say you would never get a 911 dispatch call for a bear in a house or something? No, there are cases where an environmental police officer, like any other police officer, may end up responding to a legitimate public safety concern. But that's the exception, not the rule. That's not the norm of that wouldn't be the norm of an annual budget requirement or budget line item for, and this year, 90% of our time is gonna be tied up with, well, policing or bears. Right? So, yeah. Yeah, chickens. Absolutely no respect. I'll leave it at that. I know it's a thick conversation, takes it in a little bit of a different direction, a little bit of a heavy topic.